And what year in law school are you guys? Is it a mix?
Yeah. Mix, yep.
Okay, well, at the end of the tour, there will be an exam. And in addition to the animal law issues we talk about, two of the questions will be the rule against perpetuities, okay, and the Erie Doctrine, okay?
I thought that was over.
Good one, Howard.
Did you put him up to that?
I did not.
It's just not fair. No, it isn't.
Yeah, right.
I haven't thought about the Erie Doctrine in quite a while. Thanks, Howard. I really appreciate it.
This is Apollo, and Apollo is a Siberian lynx. And Apollo is part of how the sanctuary started. Back in the early 90s, Carol, who you just met, and her then husband, had a real estate business, and they would buy small properties and put mobile homes on them. And when they had open land, they would go to an animal auction and buy a llama and put the llama on the property to mow the grass. And so that's how she happened to be at this auction. And she had also done some rehab work. She had done some work with domestic cats, and one day went to the vet, and the vet had a bobcat that was injured. Well, the vet can patch up the bobcat, set a leg or whatever if it's hit by a car, but then somebody has to take care of it for 6 weeks or so until it's ready to be released. So Carol started doing that. So she had some experience with wild bobcats. And at one of these animal auctions, there was a fellow there with a 6-month-old bobcat, terrified that he was selling. And she asked him why. And he said, well, I got it for my wife as a pet and it didn't work out, which it doesn't. And so he was going to sell it. Well, then the fellow sitting next to Carol started bidding on it. And Carol said to him, you don't want that cat. I've dealt with them. That cat will tear your face off. And he said, it's not going to tear my face off. I'm a taxidermist. I'm going to take it out in the parking lot, club it, and make it into a den ornament. Well, of course, that upset her very much, and so she outbid him for the bobcat in order to keep it from that fate. That was probably the most anybody ever paid for a bobcat, and brought it home. And what happens is when they're young, up to first year or two, they're kittens, and so they're reasonably manageable. What happens as they mature around 3 is two things. They become aggressive, they're wild animals, and they start spraying. And so if you can picture, so she had that one, and her then husband, what happens is the cats will bond to one person and not to others. So the cat, I'm telling your story, that's right. The cat was not friendly to her husband, so he decided he wanted one that would like him. And this was pre-internet, this was 1992, so they found a place in Minnesota that sold the cats, drove up there in a van, get there, and there's 56 bobcat and lynx kittens and a bunch of carcasses laying around, which was confusing. And Carol said to the guy, I had no idea there was this much market for these as pets. And he looked at her like she was crazy and said, well, there isn't. We sell a few as pets, and then a year from now, we slaughter them and make them into fur coats. So what do you think they did? Bought all 56. So if you can imagine, and they don't drink cow's milk, and so they had to go into this town and buy anything they could use as a carrier, pack up these 56 kittens, and then drive back nonstop, buying goat's milk wherever they could, feeding the kittens every 4 hours. So that's actually how the sanctuary started. 30 of them to make a coat. And 100 years ago, that's maybe the only choice we had. But now the synthetics are every bit as warm, every bit as good. And the good news is that one after the other, the major designers have decided not to use real fur. And we see that happening more and more. Michael Kors recently joined the group. So that's been really good to see. So now Apollo, the birth dates are on the sign.
Is he that old?
So he is going to be 21 next month. In the wild, they live 10 to 12. Here, they frequently live to late teens and 20. We feed the very best food. We have a state-of-the-art cat hospital, so they get excellent medical care. And one of the issues we're dealing with is we have basically a geriatric population at this point because, of course, the cats keep aging, and we are willing to take in older cats that other people don't want because we have the resources to treat them medically. So that is Apollo's story. In the wild, say this. In general, we get the cats from two kinds of people. There are either what I would call well-intentioned people who either lack the mentality or the resources to do the right thing for the cats, or get them when they shouldn't. And then there are just the bad people, the people who are mistreating the cats, using them to make money, and they in their minds claim they're animal lovers, and it's absolute nonsense. This was one of the bad guys. This guy lived in Kansas. He acquired these cats. People say, well, why do people acquire these cats? And the only answer I can give you is, think of all the things we do for ego. Look at me. I'm cool. Look what I've got. And so he had 6 small cats and 2 larger ones. And he had a business, as we understand the story, he had a business that started to decline. And he took the cats and stuck them in these tiny ramshackle cages at a relative's house in the country. And when the relative saw that he wasn't coming regularly to feed and clean them, he called the police. And it was one of the rare times where they used the local animal cruelty law, and the sheriff was wonderful. He basically confiscated the cats, and he personally came out and started feeding the cats as we organized the rescue. And these rescues are not simple things. In a case like this, we had 3 sanctuaries who have to converge on the same day with their equipment, coordinate that with the police. We have to get a permit from Florida to bring the cat in. We have to get a health certificate from a vet in rural Kansas, which is sometimes a challenge. And so when we got there, as our people were approaching these cages, they thought, wow, it's muddy. Well, when they got up close, they saw they were living in inches of feces. Okay? As they were loading the cats, the owner drives by, pulls in, gets into an altercation with the police. They end up finding a meth pipe and I think a sawed-off shotgun in his front seat. And this is the kind of people that we're dealing with. I mean, by and large, the bad guys who own these cats are just a scurrilous bunch of people. And if you think about it, how does breeding a cat and sticking it in a cage, a totally unnatural life, help with conservation? It doesn't. In fact, it's the opposite, because the U.S. State Department spends a fair bit of energy trying to convince some of the Southeast Asian nations not to do tiger farming. Are you familiar with what tiger farming is? They want to raise tigers like cattle and slaughter them in order to sell tiger bone wine and various tiger parts. And they argue that if we raise them and sell them that way, then people won't poach them in the wild. Well, the opposite is true. If you raise them that way and increase the market, the wild tiger is always going to be the premium product, right? And it's cheaper to poach a tiger than it is to feed one for a couple years to raise it. And so it will increase the poaching. But our State Department's ability their credibility is impaired because in this country there's no tracking of where these animals are, how many get slaughtered, how many end up in the illegal trade. The Chinese, when this argument is raised, stand up and say, well, at least we know where our tigers are. And last week I've got a dialogue going with people at the State Department so that we can document this to show it. There are a little over 100 inspectors. There are about 700 facilities that have big cats, licensees. So on average, the inspectors will come about a little more than once a year. Now, there are some places that come more frequently, some they don't even come once a year. And when they come, think about what they can see. They're not going to see people physically mistreating the animals because the people don't do that when the inspector's there. And what happens is the inspector comes to the gate, and the people at these places, and we know this from whistleblowers, they get on the radio and say, run around, delay the inspector and run around and fill the water bowls and don't do anything you're not supposed to do. So then the inspector comes in. So they can see if there's something wrong with the cage. They can see if an animal looks terrible. They can see if the food preparation area is not clean. But there's a limit to what they can see. They're not going to see these people who are breeding tiger cubs and then physically punishing them, trying to diminish their natural behaviors, because they're not going to be punching the tiger cubs in the face in front of an inspector. Okay, but these are the reports we get. So what happens is, and the rules are very weak, okay? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So if you're bad enough to have a bunch of serious violations, what happens is the inspector writes you up. It's called a citation. But there's no fine for that citation. So they write it up and you're supposed to fix it, and they may come back. If you don't fix it, it's called a repeat citation. what we see is they will write these citations for years, 6, 7 years, while the animals suffer. And then finally, they'll send them a letter that says, okay, enough is enough. We could fine you $50,000, but we'll settle for $4,000. On average, in 2008, Congress raised the fines from $3,500 a violation to $10,000, specifically because the fines were so low they weren't a deterrent. But USDA has limited resources. They have limited number of investigators who are separate from the inspectors, and a limited number of attorneys. And taking one of these cases to court requires a massive amount of work. So they have a huge incentive to settle these. So on average, they discount the fines 86%. Okay? So it just becomes a cost of doing business. And so, and then the people just continue. About maybe 4 or 5 people a year are so bad that they actually take away their license. Now, when they take away their license, that's just a license to have the public come in. USDA doesn't generally take the animals. And I've asked them, why not? You know, you've now got someone who's so bad that you know they're mistreating these animals horribly. And they said the way they interpret the Animal Welfare Act is they can only take away the animals if they feel the animals are in imminent danger. And so the only case in the 15 years I've been involved that we've seen that happen is the place that Smalls came from, where they went in, finally took away the license after years of horrible citations, and then said, you got to get rid of the animals. And so we took, I think, 6 animals from this place. Do you all know what the 3 major federal laws are that deal with animal welfare?
Do we? Major laws?
The 3 major federal laws. I mentioned what? Endangered Species Act. And what? Animal Welfare Act. And then the third one, the harder one,
Nobody?
the Lacey Act. And the Lacey Act is the hardest to understand because it started out doing one thing like 100 years ago and has been amended many times. But in 2003, we were part of a group who successfully passed what's called the Captive Wildlife Safety Act, which amended the Lacey Act and forbade sending big cats across state lines, which is part of making it federal constitutionally survive, as pets. And that had some impact, but what the people who want to do illegal things is, it didn't forbid them, it forbade sale as pets. So what they do is they give them away and take cash, but it still had an impact. It meant it was harder for people to do. Some of you may remember in the news back in 2011 in Ohio, there was a man who let out 56 dangerous animals and then committed suicide, and the sheriff and deputies had to shoot 49 of the animals.
They didn't have to.
Just a horrible situation. And so after that, Ohio was notorious up to that time for having no laws and all these animals living in all kinds of conditions. So after that, they passed what was a pretty good law. It had a few things we wish were different, but it basically just required people to have decent cages and to register the animals. But some of the people that own these animals are the same kind of people who think they don't have to pay federal income tax. You know, they don't have to comply with the law. That, you know, I have my rights. I have a right to own the cat. And so some of them didn't comply. So after 2 years, Ohio started confiscating the cats. The cougars don't have the stripes and spots and color, but to me, they may be the most beautiful cat. They're just so sleek and their faces are so expressive. Remember we talked about the Savannah cat, breeding the serval to the domestic cat? Well, this is a Savannah cat. So you can see it looks like a miniature serval. The owner having a little salad.
Yeah, we're like,
The owner paid $15,000 for this cat from a breeder here in Florida, south of here. Had the cat for a couple years. Cat was manageable, as I explained to you, because it was a kitten. And then as it matured at 3, started spraying, started becoming aggressive. She tried for 2 years to get the cat to be manageable. Meantime, she's got bites and scratches and finally gave up. And called us and brought the cat, and she was very good. She made a video urging other people not to get these cats. And most of these breeding facilities are kind of the cat version of puppy mills. You've heard of puppy mills where they have the dogs in tiny cages and are just constantly breeding them and they get no medical care. Well, that's how they treat the servals at most of these places. Oh, let's look behind us. This here is Risa. Risa is our most talkative cat. Rah! Rah!
She's saying.
Risa came from one of the well-intentioned people. This was a fellow in Homestead who did the best he could, but he had the cats on these tiny concrete slabs and a whole bunch of other animals, and struggled to keep the place going, and then got brain cancer, and that means then all these animals have to go somewhere else. And so we took 2 animals, and other places took others. And she had a horrible history before she got to his place. And Sundari is 21, and if you look at that coat, it's got a beautiful coat. We buy the very best food. There are a lot of places that work off of what we call the Walmart diet, where Walmart will donate the expired meat, and the expiry is not the problem. The cat's digestive systems are intensely acidic. They can kill prey in the wild and eat off it for days. But the cuts of meat we eat don't have the range of nutrition they need. Think about it. In the wild, when they take down prey, they're eating all the organs, the brain, the bones, and that's not in what we eat. Mountain lions, cougars, pumas, panthers are basically the same species. The mountain lions just tend to be bigger. Many years ago, before DNA testing, they were divided into subspecies based on various physical differences that were detected. But once they started doing DNA testing, they realized that they were so similar. There are 2 males and a female, and they came to us because when they were tiny, tiny cubs, their mother was shot by a hunter in Idaho. And the hunter picked up 3 of them, decided for some reason didn't like one, left it on somebody's doorstep, took the other 2 home, and apparently was going to try to raise them. And his brother, to keep him from getting into trouble, called the Fish and Game there. They came and got them. The people who found the one on the doorstep called Fish and Game and were told, just let nature take its course. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. It's a tiny cub. It's going to starve. So they came and got them, and they took them to a rehabber. And she found us on the internet and convinced a sympathetic Fish and Game officer to send them here. Southwest Airlines donated 6 tickets so that our 3 people could fly up and then fly back with the cats in the cabin in seats, and the pilot played Lion King over the loudspeaker. And so the good fortune for them is they've been here their entire lives. Zabu is one of our 2 white tigers. And there she's chuffing at you.
What did you call that, chuffing?
Yes. Yeah, you got company.
Got Christine and 22 guests on property.
And if you look at her mouth, fortunately she doesn't have major defects. And we already talked about the white tiger, that they shouldn't be bred, that it's a recessive, defective gene.
Do they have other health defects?
In her case, if you look at her mouth, it's like she's missing her upper lip. Which fortunately, functionally has not been a problem. The white tigers also come in a few sort of color varieties. Sometimes they have brown stripes like her. Other times they have black stripes. Occasionally they're a very faded stripe. And she's in here with a male lion that you can see back there, who we'll see when we walk around that way. That's Cameron. They came from a little roadside zoo in New Hampshire, where the husband died, the wife couldn't keep the place going, and the cats were starving. And so since they originally were put together as young cubs with the hope of breeding ligers, which is a freak hybrid that shouldn't be bred. And fortunately, we got them when they were about 4 before the breeding started. There's a wonderful organization called Animal Defenders International out of England, and they have been just hugely successful at getting countries to stop having tigers in the circus and big cats in the circus. Once these countries pass a law, then you have the issue of, okay, what happens to all these tigers? And if you do nothing and suddenly there's dead tigers all over the place, well, what happens? Then there's a backlash. See what you did? So they then help with the acquisition of these tigers, rescue in some cases. So in this case, some of the circuses went underground and hid out in the countryside. This circus originally had 12 tigers. 11 of them died in the 2 years that they were evading the law. And that when they finally found him, Hoover was the only one left. ADI got Hoover, nursed him back to health. He was in terrible shape, and asked us if we would take him. This is Nikita, and Nikita was found when she was a year old in a crack house in Tennessee, chained to a wall on a concrete slab. And again, why would a drug dealer have a lion? Well, think about it. Macho thing, you mess with me, I'll feed you the lion, that kind of thing is our best guess. Because she was on this short chain on a concrete slab, she got no exercise. So when she came here, she could barely stand, and she was 6 months old. When we get them younger, typically when they come to us, they have malnutrition, and we pump them full of calcium and vitamins. At 6 months, we were not really sure that was going to work, but it did, and she actually became very agile. And when she was younger, that yellow ball there is not like the ones you use in the gym. That weighs 80 pounds, and she used to, when people came by, she used to get her hind end on it and work it up the ball and kind of do these yoga moves. When she was younger, I came by one day and she put her paw under that ball and just went like that and sent it sailing into the air. And you think about what you see on Animal Planet. When you see a cat like this who might be 400 or 500 pounds take down a 2,000-pound water buffalo, just imagine how powerful they have to be. She is our largest animal now. We used to have a couple of tigers that were part Siberian, and so they weighed 700 pounds. But she weighs about 500 pounds, and we're lucky to see her awake. Normally after she eats, she just conks out in that spot in the sun and goes to sleep. So I had told her you were coming, so she stayed awake. A very recessive, defective gene that appears rarely, and in addition to it being a defective gene, the white tigers in this country all came from one white tiger who was brought to this country in the 50s and then bred to his own daughter to foster that gene. And so they are horribly inbred and should not be bred. And the AZA, the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, has told their zoos, which have basically the highest standards in the zoo industry, that they really should not be breeding white tigers. And so when people visit, we explain this to them, hoping that they won't go run and pay to see the next white tiger cub, because the reason they're bred is because it draws visitors who pay. So if we can make people aware that supports an activity that shouldn't be done, hopefully the market for that goes away.
Yep.
For cleaning, the cats poop around the perimeter because it's one of the ways they mark their territory. A lot of places have the cats living on concrete. Why? Because it's easy to clean. You just hose it down. And here, but that walking on concrete all the time is part of what causes the arthritis as they get older. So the way we clean is our keepers have a long pole with an L at the end, and they'll spot the poop and drag it to the edge and take barbecue tongs and pick it up and put it in a bucket, which is probably why nobody comes to our barbecues.